$4.5 billion in $100 bills weighs approximately 45 tons. To move that sheer mass of physical currency, you would need a fleet of armored trucks stretching across a city, or multiple Boeing 747 cargo aircraft loaded to their absolute structural limits. It is a physical manifestation of wealth so dense it generates its own economic gravity. Yet, a 27-year-old man named Jho Low, a soft-spoken individual with no formal economic credentials and zero official government authority, made those 45 tons of matter completely evaporate. He did not use firearms, explosives, or tactical extraction teams. He utilized poorly forged PDF documents, a labyrinth of invisible offshore shell companies, and the willful, compensated blindness of the global financial elite. This was never a conventional robbery. This was the mechanical dismantling of a sovereign nation's treasury. The target was one Malaysia Development Berhad, the state investment fund known as 1MDB. The weapon was institutional greed. The victims were 30 million citizens who did not yet know they had been plunged into generational debt. To dissect the architecture of this heist, one must first observe the illusion of sovereign wealth. A national development fund is marketed to the public as a sacred vault, a strategic reserve meant to construct power grids, fund green energy, and build infrastructure for unborn generations. In the hands of Jho Low and Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, it became a personal, limitless credit card guaranteed by the sweat of the working class. The first domino was pushed in a series of clandestine, undocumented meetings on luxury yachts and in five-star hotel suites. Jho Low understood a critical vulnerability in the psychology of political power. Leaders require monumental projects to secure their legacy, and they require untraceable capital to maintain absolute political loyalty. 1MDB was engineered to provide both. The structure was elegantly lethal. The Malaysian government would issue bonds, fully backing them with the sovereign credit of the nation. If the fund collapsed, the taxpayers would absorb the catastrophic losses. But while the money existed, Jho Low would direct the current. However, a newly minted, obscure fund from Southeast Asia cannot simply materialize in the global markets and demand billions of dollars in liquid cash. The international financial system requires a validator. They needed a titan. They needed the ultimate gatekeeper of Wall Street to stamp their illusion with an aura of absolute legitimacy. They needed Goldman Sachs. Enter Tim Leissner and Roger Eng, senior executives at Goldman Sachs in Asia. They represented an institution that operated as the apex predator of global finance, boasting an impenetrable fortress of compliance officers, risk managers, and legal auditors. The entire global economy trusted the due diligence of Goldman Sachs. Jho Low realized he did not need to breach this fortress by force. He simply needed to incentivize the guards to open the gates from the inside. 1MDB needed to raise astronomical capital under the guise of buying power assets and funding a joint venture with an Abu Dhabi state fund. Goldman Sachs agreed to underwrite 3 massive bond offerings, internally codenamed Project Magnolia, Project Maximus, and Project Catalyze. Through the sheer gravity of their reputation, they raised a staggering $6.5 billion from global institutional investors. Pension funds, mutual funds, and sovereign entities purchased these bonds blindly, relying entirely on the pristine letterhead of Goldman Sachs. This is where the mathematical absurdity of the crime becomes glaringly apparent. For underwriting bonds of this magnitude, a major investment bank would typically charge a fee of 1 to 2%. It is standard operating procedure. Goldman Sachs, however, extracted an unprecedented, logic-defying commission of nearly $600 million. That equates to roughly 9% of the total capital raised. It was a statistical anomaly so massive it should have triggered every automated alarm and frozen every trading terminal in New York. It was the financial equivalent of a fire alarm ringing continuously in a crowded building. Yet, the system deliberately chose deafening silence. The revenue generated was too intoxicating. The year-end bonuses for the bankers involved were too astronomical to jeopardize. The internal compliance committees at Goldman Sachs were repeatedly presented with glaring inconsistencies regarding 1MDB's corporate structure. They were warned about the shadowy, omnipresent influence of Jho Low, a man who was officially excluded from the deals but was orchestrating every single wire transfer behind the scenes. Despite the red flags, despite the obvious deviations from protocol, the compliance officers essentially rubber-stamped the transactions. The internal safeguards of the global banking system functioned perfectly until they were deactivated by profit. The capital was now fully liquid. $6.5 billion sat in the accounts of 1MDB, legally raised, officially sanctioned by the highest financial authorities. The public was told this money would build a modern metropolis in Kuala Lumpur and secure the nation's energy independence. The machine was fully operational. The sovereign vault was wide open. The citizens were completely unaware that the architects of the fund were already laying the digital pipeline to siphon the treasury dry. The capital was preparing to move, accelerating toward a black hole of offshore secrecy where international law ceased to exist. The architecture of international money laundering relies on a concept called layering. You must move the stolen capital through so many jurisdictions, across so many offshore shell companies, and through so many disparate banking networks that its origin becomes mathematically impossible to trace by conventional law enforcement. For Jho Low, the entry point into this subterranean labyrinth was a venerable Swiss financial institution known as Banca della Svizzera Italiana. $700 million of sovereign Malaysian capital was immediately amputated from the primary fund. It was wired directly into the accounts of an entity named Good Star Limited. Good Star Limited was registered in the Seychelles. On paper, it was presented as a legitimate energy exploration company. In reality, it consisted of nothing more than a post office box and a forged corporate seal. The sole beneficial owner of Good Star Limited was Jho Low. To execute a transfer of $700 million to a shell company with no operational history, the global banking system requires rigorous verification. The compliance officers at Banca della Svizzera Italiana flagged the transaction. They demanded proof of the corporate legitimacy of Good Star Limited. Jho Low responded by manufacturing a single, poorly formatted electronic mail from a fake web domain. He claimed Good Star Limited was wholly owned by the sovereign state of Abu Dhabi. The compliance department of a major Swiss bank accepted this fabricated document as absolute truth. The transfer was authorized. The internal security protocols of international finance were entirely nullified by a false domain name and the lure of exorbitant management fees. The money was now functionally untraceable. It belonged entirely to Jho Low. What followed was not a quiet, secretive accumulation of wealth. It was an explosion of grotesque, cinematic consumption. The stolen capital hemorrhaged across the globe, mutating into physical assets of unprecedented scale. Jho Low utilized his network of offshore accounts to funnel over $100 million into a newly formed Hollywood production company called Red Granite Pictures. Red Granite Pictures was co-founded by Riza Aziz. Riza Aziz was the stepson of the Malaysian Prime Minister. The stolen taxes of the Malaysian working class were directly deployed to finance the production of a major Hollywood motion picture. The supreme irony of this transaction is undeniable. The movie they financed was The Wolf of Wall Street, a film explicitly detailing the moral decay and psychological sickness of financial fraud, was entirely funded by the largest sovereign financial fraud in human history. Leonardo DiCaprio, portraying a financial criminal on the cinema screen, was raising a glass of champagne funded by actual financial criminals. Jho Low gifted DiCaprio a painting by Pablo Picasso, purchased for $3.2 million. He bought a transparent acrylic grand piano for supermodel Miranda Kerr. He commissioned the construction of a $250 million superyacht named the Equanimity. The vessel featured a helicopter pad, a movie theater, and a transparent glass-bottom pool. This was not merely the spending of stolen money. It was the physical manifestation of absolute impunity. Jho Low believed he had successfully purchased the global elite. He believed the system was entirely complicit. He was mathematically wrong. The fatal flaw in any complex mechanical structure is that a single compromised gear can shatter the entire machine. The gear that shattered 1MDB Development Berhad was not an international regulatory agency. It was a single investigative journalist named Claire Rucastle Brown. Operating a small independent publication called the Sarawak Report from her kitchen in London, she began receiving leaked internal documents. She meticulously reverse-engineered the digital paper trail. She published the exact routing numbers and corporate aliases that the global banking system had desperately tried to conceal. The publication of the physical evidence triggered an unstoppable chain reaction. The United States Department of Justice initiated the largest kleptocracy asset recovery initiative in its entire history. The Federal Bureau of Investigation mobilized specialized financial tracking units to seize billions of dollars in real estate, art, and corporate assets. The dominoes began to fall backward, crushing the architects of the machine. The sovereign credit illusion evaporated. Banca della Svizzera Italiana was forcibly shut down by Swiss financial regulators for egregious compliance failures. Goldman Sachs, the untouchable titan of Wall Street, was publicly humiliated. They were forced to pay a record-breaking penalty of nearly $3 billion to multiple governments, officially pleading guilty to criminal conspiracy. Tim Leissner pleaded guilty. Roger Ng was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Najib Razak, the prime minister who authorized the initial creation of the fund, was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security prison. The global financial enforcement apparatus ultimately worked. It hunted down the stolen capital. It dismantled the offshore networks. It incarcerated the corrupt politicians and the complicit investment bankers. The system proved that it could punish those who attempted to exploit it. But this brings us to the final, chilling paradox of the 1MDB Development Berhad file. The major banks paid their fines. The powerful politicians lost their power. The luxury assets were seized by the government. But the mastermind, the 27-year-old architect who engineered the evaporation of $4.5 billion, simply walked away. Jho Low remains an international fugitive, completely evading capture by the combined intelligence agencies of the Western world. He is reportedly living comfortably, shielded by governments that refuse to extradite him. The entire global security apparatus successfully destroyed the money laundering machine, but they let the operator vanish. It proves a devastating reality about the architecture of ultimate power. The international financial system is a highly secure, technologically advanced vault. It is guarded by lasers, encrypted with unbreakable digital codes, and monitored by thousands of cameras. But if you have enough stolen money to bribe the guard will simply hold the door open for you. And when the alarms finally sound, the guard goes to prison, but you get to keep the gold. This concludes the analysis of the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund collapse. If you are prepared to confront the true mechanics of global power, ensure you are subscribed to Shadow Dossier. Next week, we will deconstruct an entirely different mechanism of control. You will witness how a single line of malicious code silenced an entire continent. Stay vigilant.